During the 1930s, when you were working a lot with German patients, you did, I believe, forecast that a Second World War was very likely. Well, now, looking at the world today, you feel that the Third World War is likely?
I have no definite indications in that respect. But there are so many indications that one doesn't know what one sees. Is it trees or is it the wood? It's very difficult to say because the dreams of people's dreams contain apprehensions, you know. But it is very difficult to say whether they point to a war, because that idea is uppermost in people's mind. Formerly, you know, it has been much simpler. People didn't think of a war. And therefore, it was rather clear what the dreams meant. Nowadays, no more so. We are so full of apprehensions, fears, that one doesn't know exactly to what it points. One thing is sure, a great change of our psychological attitude is imminent. That is certain. Because we need more. We need more psychology. We need more understanding of human nature, because the only real danger that exists is man himself. He is the great danger. And we are pitifully unaware of it. We know nothing of man. Far too little. His psyche should be studied, because we are the origin of all coming evil. You see, we depend largely upon our history. We are shaped through education, through the influence of the parents, which are by no means always personal. They were prejudiced, or they were influenced by historical ideas, or what I call dominance. And that is a most decisive factor in psychology. And we are not of today or of yesterday. We are of an immense age.
Is there any one case that you can now look back on and feel that perhaps it was the turning point of your thought?
Oh yes, I made quite a number of experiences of that sort, and I went even to Washington to study Negroes at the psychiatric clinic there, in order to find out whether they have the same type of dreams as we have. These experiences and others led me then to the hypothesis that there is an impersonal stratum in our psyche.
As the world becomes more technically efficient, it seems increasingly necessary for people to behave communally and collectively. Now, do you think it's possible that the highest development of man may be to submerge his own individuality in a kind of collective consciousness?
That's hardly possible. I think there will be a reaction. A reaction will set in against this communal dissociation. You know, man doesn't stand forever his nullification. Once there will be a reaction, and I see it setting in. You know, when I think of my patients, They all seek their own existence and to assure their existence against that complete atomization into nothingness or into meaninglessness. Man cannot stand a meaningless life. And it's quite interesting to watch what the unconscious is doing with the fact that it is apparently threatened with a complete end. It disregards it. Life behaves as if it were going on. Of course, it's quite obvious that we are all going to die, and this is the sad finale of everything.
Do I think the government has more power than corporations? If you had asked me that question a few years ago, I would have said no, but today I would say definitely yes.
How do you feel about your job?
How do I feel about my job? Well, if it paid a little more, I think I'd like it better.
How do you feel about being a member of the information age?
Well, until I walked, how do I feel about being a member of the information society? That's a difficult question because I didn't know we were in the information society. By information society, I presume you mean computers and so forth. I think it's terrific. Without it, we wouldn't be nearly what we are today. It gives us the opportunity to grow both as human beings and scientifically, to make advancements we wouldn't have made otherwise.
I think it can't be helped with the telecommunications that's expanding as rapidly as it is. You just can't get away from it.
Computer.
Computer? What, you want to know what do you want to...
What's the first thing that comes into your head? Computer.
Computer, that's what we're working on now. Getting it to operate in the bank.
We begin with the breaking developments overseas. The American embassy in Baghdad under siege. The situation escalating. Hundreds of protesters storming the gates. Retaliation for U.S. airstrikes targeting an Iranian-backed militia group in Iraq. The mob setting fires, scaling the walls, breaking through the outer barricades. Protesters smashing doors and windows. U.S.
Corporation.
Corporation. I really blank.
Hello, with at least 8 people known to have died since Monday alone and thousands continuing to shelter in evacuation centres, the terrifying scale of Australia's bushfire disaster is beginning to emerge. A mass exodus from southern New South Wales is underway, with long lines of cars clogging
death toll
highways
from flash floods and landslides in and around Indonesia's capital Jakarta has reached at least 21 as of this morning. More heavy rain is also to be expected. The deadliest floods in years displaced more than 30,000 people, with train lines blocked and
North
power
Korean leader
outages.
Kim Jong-un put the world in high anxiety after announcing his plans to develop a new strategic weapon.
From the first day of 2020, Kim said that the Democratic People's Republic of Korea would actively push forward a project to develop strategic weapons that would be introduced in the near future.
Who do I think has the power in society? The rich.
Why so?
Why? They have so much influence with the laws, regulations that they impose upon us.
Well, in Turkey, Parliament will be voting later today on whether to send troops to Libya.
We begin with breaking news from Iraq. Reports of a missile strike at the Baghdad International Airport. Those reports claiming there are civilian casualties.
Breaking news. In a major escalation in tensions between the U.S. and Iran, the top Iranian general has been killed in an airstrike while leaving the Baghdad airport. The Pentagon...
Government? A little too big, I'd say.
Need better leadership.
Instant communication.
Instant communication, telephone.
Iran has announced it will no longer abide by its commitments to a crucial nuclear deal after Donald Trump ordered a strike which killed its top military leader. Let's talk more about the Iran situation and that Phase 1 trade deal with Professor Anil Gupta of the University of Maryland's Smith School of Business. Professor, thanks so much for being with us this morning. Before we get to China, I'd like to talk quickly about Iran. How could this situation possibly impact world markets, do you think?
I think the impact on the world markets, I mean, unless, there is a war between US and Iran, which is highly unlikely because both sides have signaled de-escalation. So short of a war, I don't think what's happening in Iran would have much impact on the world markets, as we have already seen, because, ultimately, right now we have a glut in oil, so therefore, any actions within Iran, etc., is not likely to have much of an impact.
Quick digression. That's been one of the nice things when random people have asked me what is going on astrologically right now, when they ask, especially if they don't have any background in astrology, or a little background in astrology. One of the nice things about what's happening right now in the astrology of it is it's very easy to just point to the chart and say, look at this cluster of all of these planets that are actually formed in an alignment, roughly in a conjunction in the same spot in the sky right now. It's sort of that cliche thing of all of the planets are basically lining up right now in the sky, and then some major event is happening on the Earth. Have you guys kind of felt that way in terms of like the pile up of planets in Capricorn?
Yeah, it's not the astrology's match to what's happening is not in any way mysterious.
Right. Well, it's just funny because sometimes it's like other mundane alignments are harder to explain. Like there was the Uranus-Pluto square like a few years back that a lot of astrologers were talking about, or I think of like funny, wacky ones, like astrologers in 1986 were talking about the like grand alignment or whatever.
The harmonic
what was it
convergence or something?
Right, the harmonic convergence, and there was like a bunch of planets in quintiles or something weird,
sextiles or something like a Star of David or something.
Yeah, and that gets a little bit more tricky to attempt to explain to some, let's say, someone that doesn't know anything about astrology. But if you,
I would just explain it as astrologers make mistakes sometimes.
Sure.
Not everybody is good at their job.
But this one, this
it's
current
visually,
one's nice.
Yeah, you kind of just put a chart together where you've got Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Pluto, Node. It's like there's a lot of unusual shit going on here. Does that make sense? With, you can be
just, like,
really simple.
Throw up this chart right here, and it just shows you that there's a bunch of planetary bodies, especially the two largest planetary bodies in our solar system, which are, besides the sun, which are Jupiter and Saturn, all in the same like spot in the sky right now, roughly speaking, from our vantage point. And that looks pretty impressive just in and of itself.
Totally.
One of the trends I've seen in astrological circles is that a lot of people have been talking about how astrologers have been talking about some of these major planetary alignments coming up for years, especially with some of the major outer planet alignments like the Saturn-Pluto conjunction, which went exact in January, and is still very much in play. And it's interesting to see some of that stuff finally start to materialize and turn into like major world events right in front of our eyes. Is that a feeling you guys have had as well? Or, I mean, obviously that's some really slight relief, but is that an experience that you guys have had as astrologers?
I think it's been shocking how I think it's been shocking how precisely the events in the world have matched the astrology in a way I think we hoped wouldn't be true. The astrology is very good at describing things both literally and metaphorically, and there are certain configurations that you really hope will stay firmly in the metaphorical. simplest and most useful pieces of timing, astrology-wise, is that we had the exact Saturn-Pluto conjunction at the end of January. Well, in the middle of January, but that's a slow thing and lasts for a bit and takes a little bit to completely show itself. And so Saturn-Pluto, as Rick Tarnas wrote voluminously many years ago, is about all of these themes. It's about hard times. It's about tremendous fear. It's about fear, control, disaster. Kind of all the bad things. And one of the experiential themes that he draws out is the feeling of isolation or imprisonment. And so certainly with mandatory quarantines, people are experiencing isolation in a new way.
Everything goes back to Saturn this year. There's this pile-up of planets in Capricorn, all ruled by Saturn in one of his own signs. And even with the sign split, with Saturn having moved into Aquarius and Mars about to follow suit, it's all still under the rulership of Saturn. And I kept sort of saying to my students at the start of the year, we just have to do the Saturn thing this year. We have to, whether it's play it safe, whether it's think about long-term rather than short-term. And it didn't seem to make sense when I was talking, I couldn't see why or how that would manifest back in January, but it was very clearly Saturnian themes. And given the extreme way that that's manifesting now, I feel like we're all getting a masterclass in the Saturnian approach of things like isolation, staying alone, being more of a hermit, being even more frugal, the idea of just going to the grocery store once a week. And that is different for many people. There are some people that go more often, or you have to cook your own food instead of eating takeout. There's all of these kind of getting back to basics, focusing on, if there are limitations in grocery stores or supply chains, is it important that you buy that fancy piece of chicken breast, or should you buy some tuna and rice? It's that idea of getting back to what's essential rather than what's frivolous. And it's fascinating to see how it's shown up. Of course, as you said, Austin, sometimes we'd like it to be more symbolic than literal, but it is very much about the Saturnian. If you've got a choice, just try and think about what is the most Saturn response to that at this point in time. By that point, we're a few weeks after the Saturn-Pluto conjunction, but they're like, this thing is going to be big, basically. I think the first deaths in China, Brian's just jumped into the chat. China announced the first death on the 11th of January, and Saturn-Pluto had their exact conjunction about 24 hours later.
Okay. And we had the eclipse then, too.
And that's right, thanks. Yes.
Right, and that's one of the things, obviously that's something we always say about eclipses, that they have a 6-month duration, and sometimes you don't always see the manifestation or realize what was initiated at that time was important until later, but it's interesting seeing that also happen with something as important as like the Saturn-Pluto conjunction, which lots of astrologers were commenting on and watching back in January, but it's not until now that we really see what was permeating or what was getting started at that time that was really ramping up, that would become such a major worldwide phenomenon just a month or two later.
The acute difficulty that we've recently been experiencing is that everything, all of the do-bads were in one place at the same time, right?
Like a
And
concentration of all the do-bads. They just got together and put all their crap in the same place.
So much of the 2008 financial crisis, astrologers often associated with Pluto moving into Capricorn and that major ingress of an outer planet into a new zodiacal sign. And it's interesting that this one is happening now towards the end of Pluto in Capricorn, as we're getting towards the end of the transit of that outer planet through this sign.
It is interesting.
That and Saturn. Saturn was opposite Uranus then, which was a huge piece of that, and that pings the Saturn-Uranus square that we're going to have all of next year, and that we're getting a little bit of a taste of this second quarter of 2020.
Years ago, Shiite Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini spearheaded a revolution that deposed the monarchy in Iran. In its place arose an Islamic republic. A repressive theocracy had replaced an authoritarian monarchy. And almost overnight, Iran had been transformed from a crucial US ally into a bitter opponent. Here are some of the key dates that led to the revolution. From 1941 to 1979, Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi, a close partner of the United States, had ruled Iran. He modernized Iran while forcefully suppressing dissent and political freedoms. The clergy opposed the Shah's social and economic reforms. Discontent grew until in 1978, anti-Shah demonstration spread across the mostly Shia country. Strikes and mass protests erupted, and accusation flew that the Shah was the US puppet. Martial law was imposed. Cassette tapes of speeches by the 76-year-old Khomeini were smuggled into the country, fueling the unrest. Many Iranians took to the rooftops at night to shout Allahu Akbar, or God is great, to express their protest. On January 16, 1979, the Shah left Iran for what was officially a vacation. Many Iranians rejoiced with chants of "The Shah is gone." The man who'd ruled the country for 37 years would never return from exile, dying some 13 months later. On February 1st, a crowd of around 3 million people in Tehran welcomed Khomeini's return from 14 years of exile. Asked about his feelings, the Islamic revivalist famously gave a cryptic one-word answer: nothing. Finally, on February 11th, the revolutionaries declared victory after Iran's demoralized armed forces declared neutrality. The monarchy was suddenly gone. Deadly factionalism followed, but Khomeini held the upper hand. And in April, following a nationwide referendum, an Islamic republic was officially proclaimed, eventually with Khomeini at its apex. Thousands of Shah-era officials and other Iranians would be executed following summary trials. Student revolutionaries would storm the US embassy, taking dozens hostage. Tehran would doggedly pursue anti-Western policies for decades to come. The revolution's 40th anniversary arrives at a critical juncture for the Islamic Republic, hobbled by US sanctions, infighting, and the frustration of a restless young populace, most of whom were born after the revolution. Some regime insiders have warned recently that the Islamic establishment could collapse. Even one of Khomeini's own grandsons warned there's no guarantee that this system his grandfather created would survive. Despite such speculation, it is clear that the clerical establishment remains firmly in place.
Tensions in the Middle East are at boiling point after the US and Iran traded missile strikes in Iraq.
The seditious presence of America in the region should be ended.
It's the latest flare-up in a long history of animosity, which reached fever pitch after the US took out top Iranian general Qasem Soleimani in a Baghdad airstrike. Although the immediate danger of all-out war seems to have subsided,
Iran appears to be
Standing down.
Despite Trump's apparent attempt at de-escalation, Iranian rhetoric has remained defiant. But is its bark worse than its bite? Since its inception in 1979, the Islamic Republic of Iran has been considered a troublemaker in the Middle East by the United States. Geographically, it's huge, second only to rivals Saudi Arabia in size and population, and according to global firepower, has an armed forces which ranks 14th in the world, ahead of Australia, Israel, and Pakistan. Still, that's 14 countries behind the USA, which sits comfortably at the top of the military totem pole. To make up for its relative lack of military clout, the regime uses a vast network of proxy militias to fight for Iran's interests in conflicts across the Middle East, most recently in Syria, where Iranian-backed fighters like Hezbollah helped turn the tide of the war in Bashar al-Assad's favour. Thought to be the mastermind behind this network was top general Qasem Soleimani.
He was Iran's meddler-in-chief. Soleimani was the commander of the Quds Force, which, if you like, is the elite form of the SAS equivalent of Iran's troops. But he was much more than that. He was also the terrorist mastermind, if you like. He was the man who meddled across the region, who tried to promote Iran's hegemony through every underhanded tactic, whether those were militias in Iraq, terrorist groups in Iraq, assisting with Assad's forces in Syria, helping Hezbollah in Lebanon, and all sorts of operations beyond as well.
For months before his death, tensions between the two countries have been heightening. The US has been increasing its military presence in the region and upping economic sanctions on Iran. That's in response to a series of attacks on US interests that the Americans believe Tehran is behind.
What the Americans are trying to do is quite simple. They are trying to restore the idea of deterrence to the Middle East and to remind the Iranians that every action has an equal and opposite and probably greater reaction. And that's why it really is in Iran's hands as to what happens next. And whether the regime itself will survive very much depends on how Iran chooses to tackle the next few weeks and months in the region.
So, if diplomacy fails, how might an all-out conflict play out?
There is no doubt the Iranian army is a sophisticated army, but it is equally no match for the US Army and Navy and Air Force. The idea, for example, that the US will invade Iran is just nonsensical. That's never going to happen. What the Americans would do in any conflict would be to degrade the regime's ability to control activity in Iran itself through airstrikes or other matters. And yes, while there may be the possibility of US planes being shot down in that process, there's no military analyst alive who would give you odds on saying Iran will beat the US in such a conflict.
But military strikes are just one of the options open to Tehran. Over the years, Qasem Soleimani, as head of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard's elite Quds Force, honed the regime's ability to influence the region in other, less conspicuous and plausibly deniable ways.
In 2019, we of course know the Iranians were behind the attack on Saudi oil. Now it's possible that the Iranians will attempt another attack on US allies in the Gulf and try and paralyze oil infrastructure or some other actions. We know the Iranians have been active in the Gulf as well, of course, in the sea itself. They hijacked a British ship fairly recently. There could be more attacks on shipping, hence why we have sent Royal Navy ships to defend our own personnel and our own ships in the area. It's also possible they could target tourists. The Gulf is a popular tourist destination. There are possibilities of attacks on civilian targets as well. And there's even the possibility that Iran could unleash its overseas terrorism capability to try and attack allied forces or civilians overseas.
All-out war may have been avoided for now, but with Iran's nuclear deal in tatters and a new raft of US sanctions set to put a stranglehold on its economy, relations between Washington and Tehran have reached a new low. Whether they can sink any lower, only time will tell.
So what this tells me is that the closer we get to solstice at this time and the immediate period around it, the more headless chicken the world's going to become. This is amplified by the set of eclipses that we're heading into. On the 28th of June, Sunday the 28th of June, around about 2:45 a.m. in the morning UK time, Mars will move into Aries. where it will then stay until January of next year. This is a game changer. Mars moving into Aries for 6.5 months. This hasn't happened for a long time. Mars goes retrograde on average every 2 years. Multiply that by 12, 24 years for each sign of the zodiac. So on average, Mars goes retrograde in Aries once every 24 to 25 years. Problem is, when Mars goes retrograde in Aries, it's not only going to be just going retrograde in the sign where it's at its most active and dynamic. It's also going to be squaring Jupiter and Saturn and Pluto 3 times. And there are specific trigger points which I've repeated a number of times, but I will put them on the record here again. 3rd week of August. Period around the 16th of October. Last week of December, although by that time both Jupiter and Saturn would have moved into Aquarius, and that's a different energy. But that time around the middle of October and the 3rd week of August is absolutely critical. It is the cutting edge of a razor blade. It is the sharpest time for many years, if not decades, that I've seen astrologically, and it's as if it's the tip of the iceberg, and we're approaching it now. We're getting there, and May has been a time of people beginning to wake up and go, wait a minute, what's going on? We don't want to do this. We don't want to be like this. June is going to be, unfortunately, a fairly provocative month, and there's not going to be a great deal of ease. Long term, I have a great deal of hope. I really do. I think this is the necessary dive into the darkness before we emerge through the keyhole into an energy of much greater light. And I know that the future of the majority of humanity is going to be pretty damn good. And not too long either. 95% of those of us alive now will see this. But this year's going to get messy. Next year's not going to be that easy. After that, well, things change.
One of the things that I expect in June is for the Venus retrograde to correlate with which is already beginning, an initial and unsustainable wash of spending that will make the various economies look stronger and as if they will recover more quickly than they actually will. There are a number of financial
because that's already
analysts
happening.
who are
Like the stock market's just like behaving bizarrely with rising and rising and rising in the U.S. even though the economy recently like grounded to a halt, and there's obviously like major cracks all over the place.
Yeah, and there were cracks before this year began. You know, this isn't striking a stone with a hammer. This is striking a rotten fruit with a hammer. But yeah, a number of financial analysts have predicted a dead cat bounce in June, which is when the market, the actual economy, doesn't have any strength in it. But even though that term is delightfully ghoulish, I didn't come up with that.
No, that's a stock market industry standard.
That's not a Austin
it's
Coppock,
that like even something that is totally lifeless will bounce if it hits the ground hard. And it's basically, you know, an indicator of false health or false vitality. And that when I heard some analysts describing this, I was like, that fits the time frame for June perfectly, because we have the Venus retrograde, which is going to, you know, the Venus retrograde, when it does give sugar, right, when it does give some sweet returns or what seem like profits when there's spending. You know, it's often not, it is not an indicator of a stable pattern to come. It tends to be an aberration. And then the end of the month, we get a lot of really challenging things, and we begin one of the three the 3 negative tent poles, the three shit shows that 2020 has planned, and the second quarter numbers will come out everywhere economically, and those will probably be devastating. And so, this Venus retrograde first couple weeks of June correlating with that dead cat bounce makes a lot of sense. The financial and the astrological seem to be saying very much the same thing there.
Yeah. How are you feeling about all this, Kelly?
Yeah, look, I definitely agree. I think that we have not seen the worst economically yet, unfortunately. And the first half of June, one thing I was really struck by when I sat with June is, yes, Venus retro for basically the whole month. Venus doesn't go direct till the 25th. So there's a sense of just being suspect. There are some things that aren't ready or aren't as stable as they might initially appear. And I think feeding into that, especially in the first few weeks of June, is that we've got these, Venus and the Sun are kind of running together in mid-Gemini, and Mars is getting closer and closer to Neptune in Pisces. And there's sort of this undertone of Neptune in the first couple of weeks of June where, given that Venus is invisible, so close to the Sun, and planets are dealing with Neptune, I just wouldn't trust the way things seem to be, that it may seem great, as you're saying, Austin, like everything looks rosy, but it doesn't make sense that it's still this shiny and bright given everything that's gone on. And as the fog clears and the Venus retrograde unravels, we're going to see some truths that will indicate this almost idyllic wishfulness is absolutely unsubstantiated.
Show of solidarity, protests against racism and police tactics are showing up around the world. CBS News senior foreign affairs correspondent Elizabeth Palmer is in London.
In Britain, officials had asked people to stay away, but they weren't listening. Instead, thousands defied the COVID lockdown rules to deliver a message of solidarity with American protesters.
Black Lives Matter!
The police stood back and watched. Everyone here knows about Britain's racist past. In the city of Bristol, the crowd pulled down a statue of a 17th century slave trader, Edward Colston. Everywhere, George Floyd's death has struck a mighty chord. In Paris, they marched. And in Rome, silent crowds took a knee. In Sydney, Australia, the focus was on Aboriginal people beaten or killed in custody. In 2015, Australia had its own George Floyd, David Dungay, who died in prison shouting, "I can't breathe." I can't breathe! As the sign says, same story, different soil.
A few hours after the peaceful demonstration ended, riot police formed up to protect the entrance to the Prime Minister's residence at number 10 Downing Street. They're being pelted by bottles from a small group, but so far anyway, the violence doesn't seem to be spreading.
Evening world. This is a look at what's going on, because it seems to me that over the last couple of years, over the last 2 or 3 years, People are sending me videos I did in 2018, 2017, looking forward to 2020, where I'm going, oh, it's going to be a real crazy time. And now here we are. Now, because we're all in it, and because we're all dancing with what's going on, all of us at the are living day by day, and we're coping. But if we go back to the way our lives were a year ago, if 1 year ago anyone had said to us that the majority of the world would have spent 3 months in lockdown, and the world was going to be the way it is now, we'd have looked at them and said, no, that can't happen, that's not going to happen. And here we are. Now, earlier this year, when I did my start of the year forecasts, I said that the stuff that's coming up in the second quarter of the year, March, April, May, was just going to be the kind of forerunner of what's really coming up. With the Saturn-Pluto conjunction, Saturn-Jupiter-Pluto conjunction in January, February, March, that was the first wave, and that really established the virus big time, not just in China, but throughout the world. In this last week or two, we've had so many Neptunian contact. We've had Mars conjunct Neptune. We've had the Moon conjunct Mars and Neptune in the last, 24 hours. We've had the Sun square Mars and Neptune over this last week. We've had Mercury square Mars and Neptune over this last week and a half. It's been a very Neptunian time. Neptune, of course, is the most common astrological symbol for things like viruses. I mean, it deals with spirituality and art and film and photography, but it's also common in illusion, addiction, viruses and things like this. As I speak, the cases of coronavirus are going up by the thousands, plural, in America, Mexico, Brazil, even though the economies are opening. There's been new clusters opening up in Beijing. Australia and New Zealand seem to be clearing. Europe is still getting more cases, although the numbers are coming down. Yet all over the world it seems that economies are opening, and I'm not saying this is a bad thing, but it's a temporary phase. I remember earlier in the year saying, look, when this is all happening, come the summer, it will try and go back to normal, and we'll go back to what we think is normal for a few months, but it won't be. The old normal is gone. We cannot go back to being the way it was, even 6 months ago. The new normal is not the same as the old. So yes, for a few months now, economies are going to open again. Politicians are going to strut their stuff and say, yes, we've beaten the virus. Forget it. The virus is here to stay. We're heading into a Mercury retrograde. It starts in a few days' time. Also, in 2 weeks from now, Mars is going to move into Aries, where it will then stay until January. We're heading into what I consider to be the peak of extremism. It's going to get messy out there. It's going to get messier, and I do anticipate the current level of angst to develop further. Now, as I speak today, I can't speak for other countries, but as I speak today in London, there's many gatherings of right-wing groups coming together to defend the nation's monuments against what they call the ravages of Black Lives Matter. And there's a lot of bottles and and missiles being thrown at police. It does seem that left versus right, white versus black. Despite all the voices appealing for sanity and unity, and I'm not talking about the politicians who are just saying stay at home, it does seem that at the same time the extremes of left and right and white and black are becoming more and more obvious. And this is a year of extremism. Jupiter conjunct Pluto in Capricorn is not a gentle transit. It is really challenging the structures and the boundaries of the society that we live in. It is changing the way that we govern ourselves and that we are governed by political groups. And there is no clear sign yet as to how this will work out in the long term. If I project this forward past 5 or 6 months from now, I mean, over the next few months, we've got this Mercury retrograde coming up. Then we've got Mars standing still in Aries in mid-August, late August, early September. And then Mars will square all of those planets in Capricorn again on its retrograde phase during September, October, early November. Then it will move forward and pass all those points again around the end of December. Next year, we've got Saturn square Uranus as the big factor, which already is looking like Saturn is going to be trying to maintain the old structures and the old systems, and Uranus in Taurus is going to be trying to revolutionize the way we manage our economies and money. So it's a mixture of the old versus the new, the structure versus the new ideas. So there's going to be a lot of economic up and down next year, and I do think the world's heading into basically a depression, even a recession. Long term, of course, there's lots of hope, as there always is. Long term, when the Saturn-Neptune conjunction moves into Aries from Pisces around 2025, 2026, the new paradigms will be in place by then. And I do believe that by then we will be in a more Aquarian way. And I do not mean the Aquarian way that some people are representing it, which is quite robotic, militaristic, authoritarian. I mean more consensual, community orientated, with less boundaries, borders, and potentially greater say by individuals and collectives into what's happening for them. Because with this many people on planet, you can try and repress people as much as you like, but at the end of the day, until both individuals and collectives feel that they have a say in how their lives are run, there will never be peace and quiet on the planet. Only when individuals feel that they have responsibility over their lives, and then they are to blame if they don't work, then the world will be a different place. Maybe that's idealist. I'm sure a number of you by now will be going, you're just a left-wing libertarianism. I'm not, I'm a realist. The ideas of individuals having power over others in the nature of greed, profit, race, religion is systematically wrong. All lives matter. Human lives matter.
Well, night owls in a remote part of Western Australia captured a stunning green fireball streaking across the night sky.
Yeah, this would grab your attention. Astronomers believe that this was asteroid 2002 NN4. It was scheduled to pass Earth around 11:20 last night. Let's hope that's what it was. It may look small. The asteroid, though, estimated to be the size of 6 football fields. Despite being clearly visible, NASA says the asteroid was more than 3 million miles away from our planet, which is 13 times further away than the moon, so there was no risk of hitting Earth. Still pretty cool to check out.
Yeah.